Okay, we're getting ready to mount the oil tank. Just want to run down the oil tank and what you get in our weld-on oil tank mount kit. Reason we like this oil tank for this type of kit is, and this is your left side, this is your drive side. It's got a nice little cutout, a nice little relief for the chain area. If you're going to mount it a little lower, that comes in real handy. It's nice and long so that, and you'll see this, later in the video, we're going to show it mounted, but it's nice and long, which brings the fill neck out away from under the seat rail, so there's not any conflict with pulling the cap off under the seat rail. It's got a relief here so that if you want to mount it in snug against the seat post, that's really easy. But one of the nicest features about it is all the fittings are on the non-drive side. They're on the left side on a Sportster. That's the non-drive side, of course. And that's really handy because that way the fittings hang down. They're not at risk of being rubbed on by the chain as the chain flops around and so forth. So beyond that, the rest of what you see here is our proprietary weld-on kit we developed for this tank. It comes with this bracket and the right bolts for the threaded bungs that are in the tank, or slugs, or whatever you want to call those. And then we include 2 sets of raw steel weld-on gussets. Reason being is the idea is that you can get practically any angle, whatever angle you decide to mount this at. This goes around the seat post, of course, and it's pre-radiused for the size of the seat post on most Sportsters, 82 to 03. Needs to be opened up a little bit for the rubber mounts, but they'll still work. But the reason, the idea is that whatever angle you decide to do this at, you can flip the gusset in all different directions. You've got 2 different angles on them. So hopefully you can come up with a combination that'll work to gusset this bracket, which is really important. Okay, beyond bolting the main bracket to the oil tank, the other little bit of prep work we had to do was I've got some machinist parallels that we just taped to the bottom rails of bottom of the seat rails. The only reason for that is just so that we can put the oil tank in there, smack it clear up against those parallels. We've got a 1/4 inch of space there. We can just push it clear up against those, and we know even though we're pushing it up against there and holding it, once we pull those parallels out, we'll have a 1/4 inch of space between the oil tank and these rails. So it just makes it more foolproof and easier to hold. Okay, so oil tank's tacked in place. We just put a few tacks on the radius part of that bracket. Later, when we tear down to do final welding, we haven't done any final welding on any of this stuff we've shown. It's all just tacked together. Later, when we tear this down to do final welding on everything, we'll fit up some gussets underneath or above that, whatever makes sense. You definitely don't want to just leave that bracket without some kind of gusset either above it or below it or both. I don't think that would last long. But just took a few minutes to hold it in place and tack it, and at least you can see what your oil tank's going to look like. The fill neck is standard HD ID inside diameter, so you could even just use your stock cap, came off the donor bike. It'll need to be cut shorter because the dipstick is too long, but if you cut the dipstick about there or whatever, it'll just be a nice fit in there, and you can reuse your stock cap if you want to. Okay, so now we've got the oil tank mounted, so we're going to talk about plumbing the oil tank. In other words, hooking it back up to the stock oil system, and want to walk you through how you know what fitting to put where on this oil tank, and also just in general, if somebody hands you an oil tank you've never seen before in your life, how do you figure out what bung goes where? In other words, which of these serves what purpose? Okay, so I happen to know what all these do, but I'm going to show you how to figure out, even if you didn't know, if I just handed you this, how you'd figure that out, okay? So the first one, the largest one, typically typically they make the largest one big because it's a drain, okay? How can you reconfirm that? Take a flashlight and look in there. If you can see unobstructed view of the other side of that tank, and I don't know, Big T, you probably won't be able to get this on the video, but if you can see reflection on the other unobstructed, in other words, you're not looking up a tube, okay? What that means is that that fitting doesn't have a tube that runs up. In other words, it's draining from the lowest part of the tank. It's also the largest fitting, which to me makes it a good drain, okay? So we're going to take this is just a plug. If you want to get fancy, you could hook up this is a 1/4 NPT plug. If you wanted to, you could hook up a 1/4 NPT fitting with a hose on it, run the hose somewhere else, put a plug in that, whatever. But we're going to keep it simple. So your 1/4 inch NPT plug goes right there. Later on, we're going to put the oil tank back in the bike and bolt it in before we put the fittings in, because I don't want to have the tank slides in like a tray, and I don't want the fittings catching me and keeping me from sliding it in. Okay, so there's one down, we've got 3 to go. Okay, working our way in. The next one, do the same trick, and I don't know if the camera can catch that, but this one happens to be the same situation. You can see the complete inside of the tank, so there's no tube running upward. So it's draining from the bottom-most part of the tank as well. Another way you could tell that is just take a wire and feel around. You can see once you get past the thickness of the bung, it's unobstructed. It's also at the lowest point. So this, to me, makes a great way to have a main feed. In other words, this is the main thing that feeds the motor, okay? So we'll probably put this fitting in here. Reason it's a 90 is we're immediately going to want to head forward with it. We're going to want to go that way because that's the direction the motor's off in that direction. Okay? All right, next one. If you look down in there, this one you can tell, you can actually see through it, but you can also see the walls of the tube. You can tell there's a tube hooked to the other side of this bung. Okay, so next thing we got to do is figure out, okay, where's that tube going? Okay, so stick your rod in there, stick it straight up in there, and it's not forcing our rod to go off in any other direction. It's just allowing our rod to go straight forward. Okay, there's the depth of our rod. That's how deep it went. Okay, and you can see that went straight all the way up to the other side of the tank. Okay. To me, that makes a great vent line, because all you need a vent to do is what it's doing. It's allowing the motor, when the motor runs, it mixes air and oil into a sloppy, dirty mist, and you need somewhere for that to go. So you want that to drain at the top of the tank. You wouldn't want that to drain into the bottom, because it would then mix in with the motor oil. You want it to squirt out at the top of the tank where there's a little reservoir of air. It needs to spray into there, so it'll fall back into the top of the oil pool when the tank is full, harmlessly circulate back into the oil, and you're off to the races. Okay. Now on an XL, it's different. The vent line is a 1/4. That's why we're going to use this small fitting, and I really don't care what angle it enters at because there's plenty of room. Also, I'm just going to do a straight on the vent, just so visually it's easy for me to tell that's the vent. Smaller hose, straight line. That one's going to go there. Okay, 3 down, 1 to go. And all these, before we actually put them in permanent, we'll wrap them in Teflon tape and sock them in there real tight. They have to be tight enough with enough Teflon tape on them to make them waterproof, obviously. We're not going to worry about that right now because these are all going to come back out and be put on once the oil tank's bolted to the bike. Okay, so 3 down, 1 to go. We've got a drain, a main feed, and a vent. And all these things, if you look in your service manual, they'll also be referenced. If you didn't do what I said in the earlier video of labeling your oil lines, no big deal. You can still reference all your oil lines to your manual. It just takes more time, and they will all have a match for everything I'm telling you here. Okay, the last thing we need is a way to return the oil. We can drain it, we can feed it, we can vent it, and we need to return it. Okay? How can we tell a return line? Well, if you take your rod and put it up in there, now it's going to be forced to turn a corner. Look how deep that went. There's where that went. Okay? You look at that, see where that's going. Perfect place for a oil return. The reason is, one really nice thing if a tank designer does it is they'll have the return spit out really near the fill neck. The reason that's really nice is once you start the bike, you can visually confirm oil circulation. You can look down in there and see the oil spitting back right in under that neck. That's really handy. First, most important thing to do when you fill up a bike with oil and start it is, first thing you do, within seconds, you need to confirm oil circulation. Because a motor won't run long without oil circulating. If it's a brand new motor and somebody put assembly oil in there, it may run a minute or 2. That's about it before it locks up. So you need to immediately confirm the circulation, and that is really handy for that. The other thing is it routes the returning oil the furthest away from where it's feeding, which also makes sense. I'm sure intuitively, if you think about it, it's going to be returning as far away from where it's heading out. So that's good for circulation. So this one we're going to use as the return line. So that fitting there will go in there. Okay. We'll put this one will go in last. We'll put these 2 in ahead of time. This one will end up facing here. This one will go in. Once we're in the bike, we'll hook the oil lines up and we'll have an oil flowing system. Okay, last time we talked a lot about the oil tank fittings, where they go, and how to route the oil lines. We've got the oil tank on the bike, as you can see, and we're just going to give you some close-ups of how all the fittings ended up looking and how the lines ended up routing. Big T, if you want to get a close-up down here, that's how the fittings ended up looking. I left our labels on there because our customer is affiliated with a paint shop and he's going to tear the bike down and finish it, so I want to make it easy for him to put it all back together. That's basically how the fittings ended up looking. I decided to use a straight fitting here. It was just easier. And I used a tight spot fitting here, which differs a little bit from how I talked about before. Other than that, we cut the oil lines as long as possible, so all of them just plugged right into those fittings we talked about and hose clamped on, with the exception of one line that wasn't long enough. That's this line right here. And just to save time and to make it easy, instead of having to go all the way back up in under this cover and up to the front to the oil pump, I forget where that line goes. It was a little too short, so I just ran a piece of hose to it, used a oil line splicer fitting, and just hose clamped that together. So the oil lines are routed. They were installed with Teflon tape, so they're completely leak-free and trouble-free so far. When we started the bike, first thing we did, of course, was check for oil circulation by pulling the cap and watching that the flow was coming back right here, which is one of the most important things you can do. And the next
Alright, the next thing we did is just to kind of tie up the wiring a little bit. The customer didn't want completely rewired fresh system. He was wanting to reuse his stock wiring. And a few of the things that we just did are really simple. If you want to come in a little bit closer here, you can see that all of the stock wiring components are still in place and relocated underneath the seat. We made a couple brackets that are really simple. Underneath this box is a piece of 1/8 inch plate with 2 holes in them just to mount this piece. It's welded to the frame, really simple. Another one is right here for the starter relay. Is just a threaded bung held in place with an Allen head screw. The other part, there's a little fuse block here that houses all the main fuses for the different circuits. It's just basically tied into place, and everything's held just with a couple cable ties. And it'll still be clean. It'll be underneath the seat, and if he wants to go even further and make a plate to completely cover it, he can do that if he wants to. Everything was basically connected back to the stock positions with the exception of the tail light, which I just left disconnected under here because the customer is going to do that himself. The battery cables relocated to the same stock position. I still use the stock cables. They were long enough. The ground cable just comes from the front of the starter around the back underneath, and it's in a tight spot, but it just connects right beneath those oil fittings that you can see on the left side of the bike. And then if you want to swing around to this other side, you can see this red wire here is the main power supply for all the just basic circuits of the bike, which is coil, headlight, taillight, brake light is basically all that's still left in this bike. That's the main power, and then this larger cable that also connects to the positive terminal of the battery goes to the starter. Everything else is pretty much in its stock position. We did add a new key switch over here to this side. Before, this bike had a ton of bracketry and a big ugly key switch
and a horn bracket
as well. And the lead for this switch, or the wire lead, was probably about 3 foot long, and all that wire, basically I just cut off the old switch, shorten the wire down to where you just have 3 or 4 inches, and it goes right back into the stock harness, and wired it into this new switch that still actually uses the stock bracket. I just opened the hole up in a little bit to accept this new switch and buttoned it back up, and that really cleaned it up. And it looks nice as it ever did. Other than that, it was just a matter of plug and play on the wiring. Disconnected what we or reconnected what we disconnected to begin with, and buttoned it back up, and runs like it did when we got it.
Pretty much where we leave off. Like I said, the customer's affiliated with a custom paint shop, so he's going to tear it down and paint it and pretty it up and do the tail light and some other stuff to it. So I'm sure when he gets it done, we'll post pictures on the website like we used to do. This pretty much is our in-house service for converting a Sportster to a 200 hardtail, mainly focused on the rear back. As you know, we have other kits for include the front end package. Pretty much everything you saw in these videos is available directly from us. Most of it, 99% of it's right on the website. You can just go order it through our shopping cart. See anything you want that you don't find on the website, just give us a call and we'll hook you up.